again while you're still thinking about everything Brian has shared and talk for a few minutes about religious orders, really briefly. I'm sure, no doubt, you have heard of monks and nuns and sisters and brothers and friars. All of those are people who live what we call a religious life, and they are part of religious orders, or also, which we also call religious communities. Now I want to say a word first of all about priests. There are two kinds of priests, if you will. There are diocesan priests, and there are order priests. Monsignor Art is a diocesan priest. He studied to serve this diocese. He is obedient to the bishop of this diocese, and he is, as the majority of diocesan priests are, serves at the will of the bishop and is usually assigned to a particular parish to pastor the flock of that particular parish. But not all priests are diocesan priests. Many of them belong to religious orders. And so when you hear of a Jesuit priest or a Dominican priest or an oblate, these men are priests who belong to religious orders. But it's not just priests who belong to religious orders. Men and women do. And those men and women might be brothers, they might be sisters, or nuns, or friars, or abbesses, or all these other designations. Throughout history, men and women have been called by God to start and to join religious communities, to do different special works. It might be to serve the poor, or help the sick, to care for orphans, to teach, to evangelize, to spread the gospel in other countries. For many, many ways, and many, we call those sort of charisms that various religious communities have. And religious orders are all structured. They can be structured a little differently, but typically, if you belong to a religious order, you share a communal life with your brothers and sisters in that order. You pray the divine office. Monsignor talked a lot about that. We talked about that last week, what the liturgy of the hours are in the divine office. Most people in religious communities pray that. And then they also have their own specific kind of prayer and life and work that they do. There are 4 distinct categories of religious orders. And these are sort of designated, these categories are in canon law and they have different sort of aspects and facets to them. But needless to say, there are basically 4. The first are monastic orders. And those are going to be orders like the Benedictines and the Trappists and the Carthusians and the Pauline Fathers. These are monks and nuns, typically, who live in monasteries. They have a common life. They are cloistered, which means they have very little contact with the public, or they're contemplative. And sometimes they also serve people outside of the monastery in various ways. Monasteries have actually played a huge and very significant role in the history of the church and in secular culture through history. If it wasn't for monasteries, we would be so much the poorer. They are responsible throughout history to have preserved manuscripts and books and recipes and art and so much of culture. And they still continue to do that today. The second major category, which has orders that you would be familiar with, is called the mendicant orders. And these are the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, orders like that. They are typically friars and brothers and priests and sisters. And the mendicant orders live on charity. They live on alms and they do not own property. And a lot of them were founded by many saints who really wanted to do something radical for God and really wanted to get back to the basic gospel message. So you think of St. Dominic and St. Francis, men like this. And there are many different branches of Dominicans and Franciscans and Augustinians and Carmelites as well. The Carmelites would fall under the mendicant order. There are 2 other categories we're not as familiar with. I know that I don't hear, especially this next one very often, but it's called the Canons Regular. And the Canons Regular, an example of that order, religious order, is the Norbertines, if you might have heard of that. The only difference really, they share common life together. They also they share common property together. But the big difference between them and say a life of the monastic order is that they are called to serve more publicly. And they typically serve in a parish or a diocese. So they're not as contemplative and cloistered or private as say the monastic life. And the fourth is called the clerks regular. Again, these aren't really important terms, but just to understand that there's four main categories. Under the fourth is the Jesuits. They are considered clerks regular. And these are priests and brothers who take vows and who live a very active, they share a common and communal life as well, but they tend to be a very active apostolic life in academia and teaching and missionary work and such. Everyone also in religious life and religious order takes solemn vows, usually of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And sometimes some orders will request an additional vow that their members will make that relates to the particular special focus or charism of that order. So that's religious orders in a nutshell. Do you have any questions or comments?